The NFL is broken down into 8 different divisions, so today I wanted to go ahead and rank each division from worst to best. Now before I get to my list, I want you guys to know this is just an opinionated video, so if you guys do disagree, you can let me know your list in the comment section below, but let's go ahead and hop into my list. And in last place, in 8th place, is going to be the NFC South. This division consists of the Atlanta Falcons, the Carolina Panthers, the New Orleans Saints, and the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And while this division has been dominated throughout various parts of the 2000s, this division has really been in decline for quite some time. Both the Saints and the Tampa Bay Buccaneers are just kind of holding on to their glory days, and unfortunately neither one of those teams are really good, serious contenders. They do have a chance to make the playoffs this year, but that is just simply due to the fact that the division sucks. But all in all, there's just not a whole lot to really like about this Saints team, nor this Tampa Bay Buccaneers team. Then arguably the worst team in this division is the Carolina Panthers, and while I do think they are taking steps in the right direction, they're still several years away from being any sort of championship contender. I like Bryce Young, I like Dave Canales, but like I said, they're still a couple years away from being any sort of genuine threat in that division. And then my personal favorite to win the division is the Atlanta Falcons, but I would be lying to you guys if I told you guys that that is a perfect team. I will say they are by far the youngest and most talented team within that division that is a serious contender. And while I do think the Atlanta Falcons could easily win over 10 games, I kind of struggle to think that they're a championship contender, but I do think that they have a chance to be so. But all in all, you have 2 very mediocre teams, 1 really bad team, and 1 team that could be good next year. It just overall makes for a pretty lackluster division that I don't see being very good next year. Next up in 7th place is going to be the AFC West. The AFC West includes the Denver Broncos, the Kansas City Chiefs, the Las Vegas Raiders, and the Los Angeles Chargers. And this is a division that is honestly pretty similar to the NFC South, but what makes this division slightly better is that, well, they have arguably the best team in the NFL with the Kansas City Chiefs. Obviously, the Chiefs are one of the best teams in the NFL, and we're not going to sit here and try to argue that. They are a deserving champion from last year. They have a Hall of Fame quarterback in Patrick Mahomes, a Hall of Fame tight end in Travis Kelce, and a Hall of Fame head coach in Andy Reid. To go along with one of the best offensive lines and best defenses in the NFL, it is one of the best teams in the NFL. But then outside of that, you have arguably the worst team in the NFL with the Denver Broncos. I actually think they could be kind of sneaky alright next year, as in maybe 4 to 5 wins next year instead of 0. But it's very obvious that they are clearly a really bad team that is rebuilding. But then you have 2 wildcard teams. These are better teams in my opinion than the Saints and Buccaneers of the last division, but they're kind of similar and on a similar tier. The Las Vegas Raiders have a lot going for them, but I still have question marks with their current quarterback room. As a Raiders fan, I want to be optimistic to say that this team is going to be anything special next year, but I really have a hard time saying that this team is even going to make the playoffs next year. Overall, I do think it's a roster that's heading in the right direction, but it does need a franchise quarterback, so I'm kind of just waiting to see what they do at the quarterback position before I get any sort of hope for that team. And then there's the LA Chargers, who I think are a pretty hard team to predict next year, but if I had to put my prediction out there, I don't think they're going to be great next year. I think they're going to be somewhere between 7 to 10 wins next year. If you guys want to see more LA Chargers content, I have uploaded a video about it recently, so I'll have that pinned up at the very end. But all in all, you have 1 fantastic team, 2 kind of question mark teams, which I don't believe will be that good, and then 1 really bad team. But then things start to pick up a lot with number 6, which is going to be the NFC East. The NFC East is highlighted by 2 dominant teams like the Dallas Cowboys and the Philadelphia Eagles, and then 2 really subpar teams in the New York Giants and the Washington Commanders. Now, what I will say about the NFC East is it does feel like the dynamic between these teams is beginning to start to shift, but I still feel like we are a few years away from seeing the Giants and Commanders really take the next step to potentially win this division. We'll begin with the Philadelphia Eagles, who are obviously probably the favorites to win this division, and rightfully so. They have a loaded roster from top to bottom with some new coaches, and I do think that team is going to be pretty awesome next year. Again, like some other teams, this is a team that is not a perfect roster quite yet, but it's definitely a very good championship contending roster. And then you have the Dallas Cowboys, who in my opinion, their control of the division is starting to shift a little bit with some of the recent moves they made this offseason, which were pretty bad. I still feel like this team has enough talent to be a very good and hard team to beat next year. I still think they're going to make the playoffs, but I am a little bit worried about the future of the Dallas Cowboys. I'm not too worried for next year. I think they'll probably win over 10 games, but we'll see in 2025 and 2026 to see how the dynamic of this division changes, because the Washington Commanders are a team that I look at and say they can be pretty competitive this year. They essentially overhauled the roster from top to bottom, went out there and got a new head coach and a new quarterback, and I think this team is actually heading in the right direction as a team overall. Now, I have to actually see it on the field before I say that that team can make the playoffs, but I want to put that team as potentially a dark horse candidate to make the playoffs next year, so we'll just kind of have to keep our eyes on them. Then you have the New York Giants, who are in a pretty tough position with Daniel Jones, but for the most part, the roster is not that bad. Really, outside of the crucial positions in the offensive line and in the quarterback room, this team actually has a pretty solid foundation to build upon. So while some people actually think the New York Giants are kind of screwed, I don't think they're completely screwed quite yet. I do want to see more from this team, but I don't think they're that bad overall. Next up at number 5, we're going to be talking about the AFC East, a division that in my opinion is really freaking awesome, but I just have a lot of question marks about the division as a whole. In this division, you have the Buffalo Bills, the New York Jets, the Miami Dolphins, and the New England Patriots. We'll start off with the Patriots because they are probably the easiest team to diagnose in this division because it's obviously the worst team in this division. I do like Drake May and I like a lot of the talent on this team, but it's clearly that this team is going through a rebuild and not going to be very good next year. But then you have the Bills, Dolphins, and Jets, who in my opinion are all championship and playoff contenders. The New York Jets, even though they've been pretty mediocre the past couple years, have a buttload of talent to go along with a bunch of veterans who can help this team win now. As long as the veterans can stay healthy, which is a big if they can do that, I think it's a very good team that could easily be a championship contender. Then you have the Miami Dolphins, who similar to the Buffalo Bills are going through a bit of a retooling phase as they get rid of some of the bigger contracts on the roster and replace them with some smaller contracts. The Miami Dolphins are probably a bit more equipped on offense to be a bit more special, whereas the Buffalo Bills kind of have a better overall roster. I think both these teams are going to take a step back from last year, but I still feel like they're going to be very good teams that could still potentially make a deep playoff run. So all in all in this division, it's really hard to rank them just given the unknowns with this division, but I do think for the most part, it's a really solid division. It just doesn't stack up quite as well as some of the other divisions in front of them. Next up at number 4, we're going to be talking about the AFC South. Now, I am a lot higher on the AFC South than a lot of other people, but that's just simply because I actually really do believe in a lot of the young talent in this division. And that's to me what makes this division so awesome. It is probably the youngest division in the entire NFL, but they're still playing some really good football. The Texans are obviously one of the favorites to potentially win the AFC next year. I do think we need to calm down a tad bit on the Texans and just kind of give them some time to develop the roster as a whole. But when you have CJ Stroud, a loaded offense, and a loaded defense, it does make sense for this team to be a competitive contender next year. Then you have the Indianapolis Colts, who in my opinion are the most underrated team in the entire NFL. They were quite literally like one play away from making the playoffs last year with Gardner Minshew. Now they get Anthony Richardson back and get a bunch of improvements from this year's draft with guys like Adonai Mitchell and Latu, and you still have this very loaded roster that's continuing to get better. I feel like this Colts team is super underrated and could easily win over 10 games. In fact, I would basically book it that they're going to win over 10 games if they stay healthy. Then you have the Tennessee Titans, who in my opinion are a very good and very well built team. For me, this team just kind of comes down to can Will Levis take the next step. As we all know, Will Levis had showed a little bit of promises in his rookie year, but it was very inconsistent, and I just really want to see some consistency with his play. If we do get consistency, it's at a high level. I think this Titans team could be very, very good next year and a sleeper contender to make the playoffs. Then you have the Jacksonville Jaguars, and while everyone is getting down on them and kind of burying them in the dirt, I still feel like they're a very competent team that could easily be the winner of this division. I think we're all kind of just hiding the fact that Trevor Lawrence is still a very talented and very good team, and I think in general, this Jacksonville Jaguars team is starting to become somewhat overlooked. And while I may personally not rank them to win the division next year, I will definitely have them somewhere very close to making the playoffs. If Trevor Lawrence can take the next step, and if the team as a whole can continue to get better, this is a very good team and very competitive team that could beat any team in the NFL. So all in all, I think you have 4 genuinely good teams. It just sort of doesn't stack up quite as well as some of the other teams in front of them. Next up at number 3, we're going to be talking about the NFC West, and I am very high on this division as a whole. In this division, you have the Arizona Cardinals, the LA Rams, the 49ers, and the Seattle Seahawks. And I think 3 of these teams are basically surefire locks to make the playoffs, whereas 1 is a bit more of a question mark. We'll start off with the Arizona Cardinals because I actually really do like the Cardinals this year. I don't think they're going to be making the playoffs this year, but to me, this Arizona Cardinals team is going through these steps of actually becoming a very good team. Last year, they were bad. This year, they're going to take a step forward, and by next year, they're probably going to be really close to making the playoffs, if not making the playoffs. They obviously have their franchise quarterback and franchise wide receiver and franchise left tackle, which are 3 of the most important positions to get down. And while this team does have a lot of holes, this is a very competitive team that, in my opinion, can compete with anybody in the NFL. But more interesting, in my opinion, is the 3 contending teams in this division, because you have Seattle, the LA Rams, and the San Francisco 49ers. By the way, I just made a Rams video. I have it pinned up right now. If you want to check that out after this video, go right ahead. To me, the Rams have the makeup of what can be a very, very competitive team next year. I think they actually are kind of underrated. I don't think anyone's going to predict them to win the Super Bowl, but I think they should definitely get a bit more love because they have all the makeups of a very good team. Then you have San San Francisco, the obvious winners of the NFC last year, they're just going to be just as good, if not better, than they were last year. Then, of course, the Seattle Seahawks have a buttload of talent as well, with an influx of younger and older talent. This is a team that could easily win this division. I don't really worry too much about the Seahawks making the playoffs. For me, it's just what do they do within the playoffs, because I think they're a very good team with a lot of really good talent, and I personally do believe in Geno Smith. But the thing that really takes me over the top with the Seattle Seahawks is Mike Macdonald as their head coach. I really do believe in him, and I do think he's going to be able to turn that team into a contender pretty soon. But now we enter into our top two, and in my opinion, both these divisions stack way ahead of every division below them. Let's talk about it. At number 2, we're going to be talking about the NFC North, with the Chicago Bears, Detroit Lions, Green Bay Packers, and the Minnesota Vikings. This is a division that I'm projecting to be really good next year. Obviously, the past couple years it has not been as pretty, but when you have, in my opinion, the two arguable favorites to win the Super Bowl this year in the Green Bay Packers and Detroit Lions, to go along with two wildcard teams that I think have the possibility of being really good in the Minnesota Vikings and the Chicago Bears, it does make up for one of the best divisions in the NFL. It's a young division while also having older veterans who can help you win now, and that's to me what makes this division so interesting. We'll start off with the Detroit Lions, who are my favorite to win this division. Obviously, last year they were just a few plays away from being in the Super Bowl and arguably should have been in the Super Bowl last year. They are a team that just got significantly better this offseason, going out there and bolstering their secondary and any issues they had offensively, and they brought in even more talent to fix those problems. I really like where this Detroit Lions team is heading. I'm just a little concerned about Jared Goff and his contract, but it should not affect their play next year. Then you have the Green Bay Packers, who made some significant strides this offseason to get a ton better. They were aggressive in free agency while also being aggressive in the draft, and I really like what I saw from the Green Bay Packers, and I think they're heading in the right direction as a team. If Jordan Love can take that next step to become even better as a player, this team could arguably win the division and win the whole thing next year. Then you have the Chicago Bears, who are super young and super loaded with talent. They have one of the best defenses in the entire NFC and one of the best rookie combinations in Rome Odunze and Caleb Williams. If those guys can match their potential in their rookie year, we're talking about a team that could easily win over 10 games and be really awesome in their rookie seasons. Then you have the Minnesota Vikings, who've already built an established roster to surround a guy like Sam Darnold or JJ McCarthy with. If this team does reach the expectations of what this team should have, they're easily a playoff contender, and I think they could easily make the playoffs. So in my opinion, this division consists of two potential champions and two more potential playoff contenders. I really think this division is heading in the right place. But then in first place, we have the AFC North, which is a division that in my opinion includes 4 championship contending teams. Now, of course, there are some teams that are a little bit more championship contending worthy than others, but I'll let you guys interpret that in your own way. We'll start off with the Pittsburgh Steelers, who've done a really nice job of rebuilding and sort of retooling their roster. The offensive line is basically all brand new, and I really like where they're heading with that unit. Offensively, they just got significantly better to fix a lot of their problems in this year's draft, and even so, they didn't really have to fix a ton of the problems because the defense was pretty awesome last year. But then offensively, you've got your major position taken care of. You have your starting quarterback for this year and for this foreseeable future, going out there and getting Russell Wilson and Justin Fields, when last year your starting quarterbacks were Kenny Pickett. And hell, last year with Kenny Pickett and Mason Rudolph, you made the playoffs and were very competitive with every single team, so this team's going to be even better with a guy like Russell Wilson, who has a ton of experience winning a lot of games. While I don't feel like Russell Wilson is a permanent fix for this roster, I do feel like he is the perfect guy to take this team to the playoffs next year and help them be a very competitive team within the playoff landscape. Then you have the Cleveland Browns, who in my opinion are in kind of a make or break season this year. They're in a situation now where they have to be super competitive and they have to make that deep playoff run to give this team the hope that they can eventually win the championship. It's an all-in year for this team, and in my opinion, that sounds very good for the rest of the division, because the rest of the division is kind of in a similar boat as them. Each one of these teams has to win now, or there's going to be a couple consequences if they don't. Next up, we have the Cincinnati Bengals, who of course have probably the best or one of the best quarterback receiver combinations in Jamar Chase and Joe Burrow. With a pretty loaded roster from top to bottom to go along with a revamped offensive line, this team is definitely one of the better teams in the NFL and one of the better teams in the AFC North. After missing the playoffs last year due to injury, I don't foresee that happening this year, and I think the Bengals have a very good chance of winning the AFC. But then of course there is the Baltimore Ravens, who similar to the Detroit Lions had a couple plays went their way in the AFC Championship game. They're sitting there in the playoffs trying to compete for a Super Bowl. With Lamar Jackson looking better than ever in his new physique, I think this AFC North is going to be one of the best divisions in the NFL, and I would not be surprised if the Super Bowl champion does come from within this division. But you guys tell me, what do you guys think of my list? Do you guys think my list is wrong? And if so, let me know in the comment section below. But I love you guys. Peace.